Okay. People sometimes ask me what it is like or what it means to teach at Evergreen in particular. And the safest and sanest thing I can say is that it's not like teaching I've done anywhere else before. While faculty members here do lots of non-teaching things, I mean, we're on DTFs and boards and committees and this and that, the entire institution is oriented toward the business of teaching and learning. That's the centerpiece of what we do, and that is what is most distinctive about this institution, and that is the way in which we engage in the business of dealing with what I call matters of substance.
I was attracted by Evergreen because of the marvelous first catalog, which promised a considerable amount of flexibility, freedom, and experimentation, both through faculty and students. Somehow they arrived at Evergreen often with exaggerated and optimistic expectations. But whenever they came to class, whenever they talked with you, they were serious about learning, about exploring the world, about stating their opinions, and I found them an extremely exciting group to work with. Often they challenged me, and often I felt a little bit, frankly, strange that an 18-year-old person would ask me about a man who was in his 50s, whether I was right or wrong, and whether my opinion was really based on particular sort of solid evidence. But I learned to live with it, and as well as with hearing my first name, rather than the respectful doctor, professor, which I had been used in my previous academic career, I found it rather amusing, in fact.
Now, see, I never question what the teachers say, because that's not because I'm older than most students.
I mean, the idea that you can call your professors by their first name is already a plus in my book, because it puts you on not a peer level, but an understanding level. It's not, they're within grasp, I should say, of your education, and they're always going to be there.
There's a big difference in other places that I've studied and here, because there's more opportunity here for that feedback and for the interplay between students and teachers.
We collaborate in teaching and learning with peers and with students for the sake of all of our finding out something more about a set of issues or a set of questions or a set of problems than we knew at the outset. The fact that we join together to do this kind of learning means several things. One thing is that the standard, traditional, conventional barriers between student and professor come down. Now, I mean it's simply because people call each other by first names and go to potlucks together. What I mean is that when students see a faculty member actively engaged in learning with them, they are more likely, I believe, to invest in that learning themselves. An example. Last spring quarter, spring of 1988, with a visual artist, Susan Aurand, I taught in a group contract called Word and Image. Now, one of the things that we did in that group contract was all of us take life drawing from Susan. Susan was the teacher for life drawing. I was a student in life drawing. So every life drawing session, I would go in with my portfolio and my charcoal and my rags, right? And I'd position myself at an easel and get a fix on the model and so forth and begin these drawings. It was delightful. First of all, the students laughed My drawings were so bad. The students would come by and they'd say, "Oh God, Rudy, it's just awful." But they loved it. Bit by bit, the students would come by and say things like, "Hey, you're getting better," right? "Hey, you're learning about shading, and you're learning about this, and you're learning about that." And they got the sense of my being vulnerable and being uneducated in drawing. They also got the sense of my motivation to learn drawing, my willingness to take some risks, and that seemed to give them impetus or motivation to take the risks that they needed to take when I taught creative writing, in which workshops Susan was a student, right? So I would trade places with Susan, and I'd become the teacher, and I would teach creative writing, and Susan would become a student along with the other students, so that there's this sense of learning as a shared venture, okay? That is very distinct from my experiences elsewhere, both my experiences as a teacher and my experiences as a student.
I was in a program the first year with 5 faculty, that is 5 of us all together. And I was teaching with a biologist and a psychologist, someone from literature, and a mathematician. This was a fairly large team, and I'd never taught with more than one other person, and then not in a real attempt to do interdisciplinary work. What did I discover? What did I discover by doing that work? One thing that was very clear was that my own discipline, anthropology, in and of itself is so holistic and provides such a framework already for thinking about connections within society and culture, that it became a kind of, for me, a glue for the whole program. I mean, not to say that it necessarily did for other people, but what I discovered was, through that, I remember very distinctly thinking that every team should have an anthropologist, because what I would see is that there was a struggle, for example, the mathematician, to imagine the connections between the elements of the program, whereas there was no problem for me to see those connections.
One of the things that I thought was interesting throughout the book was a sense of what's worth being afraid of in nature. And that was something that caught my attention, and I started a list, as far as I could tell from her point of view, of what was worth being afraid of and what wasn't worth being afraid of. And it struck me because growing up in the city, all the things she said weren't worth being afraid of, I was, of course, taught to be terrified of, right? Bats, be scared of bats. Brown recluse spiders, of course I'm going to be afraid of a brown recluse spider. Termites, you know, immediately rip out the floor. Don't wait for anything.
I like the way she dealt with that.
I
She'll have
thought
plenty
so
of time
too.
to rebuild the floor.
Yeah, that's right. Eat it all. Before they eat it all. Let them eat
They're
a while
slow
longer.
eaters.
It's no big deal. But I thought it was interesting that in my list of what to be afraid of, according to her, the one thing I have is chainsaws.
There's a kind of connection with interdisciplinary work, new avenues open by teaching with people, by reading materials for programs, and then kind of going out with one of those things or more, testing it, working with it in a research setting, if you will, or in a community, coming back into the teaching with the next piece that you've learned from that, and then that continuing on in that spiral. At least that's the way it's worked for me.
One of the things that we've been experimenting with over a period of years is aiding students to work in series, to identify a theme for their work, focus on single images, allow a single image to suggest next steps for their work, following those next steps, and allowing the series of images themselves to initiate skill development or a quest for further skills. That is, the skills are not predetermined. It's not like we say, well, look, in order to be a good draftsman, you've got to learn this, you've got to learn that. More what we're trying to do is can an image that a student dreams of themselves teach them not only how to learn, but what to learn?
Another, I think, very distinct element in the ways in which we teach and learn is the degree of responsibility that we, in effect, as faculty members, surrender and turn over to students. So that once we lay out what I tend to think of as a kind of floor, that is, a sort of set of minimal expectations, which is what you find in the program description and in the syllabus, and that stuff represents the floor. Then we think it is up to the student to construct the metaphorical ceiling.
They identify an image. They have a few weeks to find it. And if you look over here, you'll see an image that was found by one of our students in Studio Project in 1987. And he identified a place. And it was curious. He needed a lot of support to actually draw that, because he kept saying, well, there's nothing happening here. It's just a corridor, and I've never been there. I don't know really where it's coming from. It's just an image. And I said, that's all you need, is just an image. And so he worked with this image for a while, made it, and then did a series of drawings to investigate this one. Working with a staircase, he was looking at it. In this drawing, the next drawing, he was working on the feeling of being present in this place. So in focusing on feeling, he suddenly was able to use the material in a completely different way. The charcoal, the strokes, the method of making the image present has a different quality, a different tone. And that in itself was a very dramatic shift for him. And it came, as I said earlier, thinking about one drawing being a teacher for the next one. And from here, he went to another drawing in which he tried to explore even further what it was like to be inside the staircase. And he got quite confused and very excited and just started thinking about line and texture and shape and form. And from here, he realized that he was much more interested in what was happening outside the staircase. What was the staircase in? He asked himself that question and drew this larger drawing in which he stepped out of the image entirely and looked at it from a distance. So that somewhere in here, in these forms, this activity is occurring. I think that what is important about this series and what's important about this kind of approach is simply that he has decided what the progress of his work is going to be over time. Only he knows or knew when to shift and when to switch to another position, to another vantage point, to a different way of drawing. And it wasn't connected to the development of skill as being an issue in learning how to make drawings. It was connected to the path that his own images wanted to take. In that sense, there was no way at the beginning of this course of work that anyone, including the student, could have predicted a set of outcomes or a set of goals for this path. There's no way, if you look at the first drawing again, that you could imagine or know that this place that he drew was taking place inside this cylinder.
Hello, my name is Hugo Flores. I am a Evergreen student. I did graduate last year, but I still feel like Evergreen student. My background is science, marine biology, and also photography. And that's what I have been doing basically at Evergreen. Also, I have been teaching Spanish as a second language. When you study sciences, it's kind of a pretty raw, pretty dry subject. And I was using photography to be able to combine, to be able to explore my other feelings about how I see life. When you study science, you have to be really precise. You are concerned about data, and you are not concerned about feelings. You don't feel in science, although there's a lot of argument about this, but when you write a scientific paper, you don't write about what you feel about these fishes or these organisms. You just write data, and you present that data, and someone else is going to read it, and that's it. Photography gave me the chance to explore my feelings and to be able to, through my photographs, to be able to express how I see life and different aspects of life.
The issue becomes, why is this important to him? Where does it lead? What does it have to tell him? And I've had students who, in doing work like this, will be drawn to working with microscopes. They suddenly, especially like in a drawing, if we go from here to here, and they say, well, if these stairs are not these stairs, or they are these stairs, or I'm coming from downstairs, but the whole experience is not a staircase as we know it in a building. It's some set of levels or some process of going up and down inside of a tube, which looks very much like a plant stem. So it's almost as if he's doing a close-up of a plant. And so I'll say, well, maybe you are. Have you ever looked at one? No, I haven't. Fortunately, the art building, where we teach this, is right in the sciences building, and they just go upstairs. They run upstairs and they say, listen, do you have a stereoscopic microscope I can borrow? They say, sure. And he takes it, runs downstairs, and he puts plants underneath it, and he says, I'm doing plants. This may not be a drawing about buildings. It could be a drawing about plants, and the whole process of moving in and moving out, moving up, moving down, getting very close to what seems like a plant-like form has enabled him to have a dialogue with himself about his own interests. And whether or not their interest in visual art or plants or staircases or architecture or science, we don't know yet. And very often, students who will go through a process like this give themselves permission to study a discipline that they would never dream of studying had they not done this. It's almost as if their own work leads them into another study.
Hi, I'm Cindy, and I've been going to Evergreen for 5 years. The reason it's 5 years instead of the normal college 4 is I'm going for the dual degree that they offer. And I have enough credits for a Bachelor of Science, and that'll be in marine biology. And right now I'm studying Spanish culture, or as they call it, Spanish forms in art and life.
Connections is what Evergreen is all about, and so we're always looking for ways to connect the lectures with labs, the physics with the math, the chemistry with the physics, etc. And I always bring a lot, as much as I can. This lecture didn't happen to, but I like to bring in various historical parts of the physics. And in this particular quarter, we've been reading some of the history of science, physics, chemistry, mathematics. So it's been nice to be able to, every now and then, remind them back to something that we discussed in seminar as well. And that's rather rewarding to me, and I think to them.
Right. Certainly, a sense that the seminar is more than a recreational thing. Is important.
And that it really is also connected, although it's a very different sort of activity. And there are students who aren't doing as well in these things who are doing very well in the seminar. So it again gives people a chance to succeed in different ways.
In more than one way, sure.
I think seminar is cooperation. You take some kind of material, such as a book, and you might read through it and form your own opinions on the material, and then meet with, say, 20 to 30 other students and discuss your opinions as well as theirs and come up with new ideas. It's really useful.
I've had to be much more disciplined, because when you go into seminar, you have to know what you're talking about or else you can't participate. And when you've got a lot of well-read people who've done the assignments and who are aware of what we're studying in class and who've got a real heartfelt interest in putting it into practice, to just sit there and not be able to participate is a really hard thing to go through, because the atmosphere is one where you want to get involved. And so I personally have to be a lot more more disciplined, and it's nice. I like to. It's not a chore anymore. It's something that I want to be able to do, which is great.
It takes place outside in the grass, in a classroom with chairs, in people's houses, during potlucks. It can happen anywhere at any time, and does, and it's wonderful.
I'm going to be getting a stack of papers tomorrow, and I find it doesn't represent that kind of oppressiveness that it always used to. And I think the last batch of papers I got 3 weeks ago, I was actually quite disappointed in that I'd made a very ambitious assignment, and my students, for various reasons that don't matter here, gave me very short and undeveloped papers. And I knew, because I know these students very well, they're students I've been working with for a year and a half, I knew that sort of berating them for not taking the assignment seriously or sort of making them feel guilty for not having done what I told them to was not going to help them in their writing or produce the next draft, which was coming in tomorrow, was not going to do what I wanted. So what I did instead was I just wrote these lengthy responses back. In a few cases, my comments back were longer than the papers that I got. And I have the sense that that's going to be more successful in getting the students to write more developed and serious papers than anything I could tell them about how they fell short of the assignment. Just the fact that their writing is being taken that seriously.
If I'm having fun here, generally they're having fun up in the audience. And there's a lot more give and take and so on.
Right, right, right. And so going back to this particular session, not as an example of all your teaching, but just this session by itself, were you having fun?
I was having fun. I actually spent too long on one part of the lecture. And it was the part in measuring the spring constant. I tried to measure it in two different ways so that we could get a comparative answer, because that's another thing we're trying to teach them to do in laboratory, for example, is to find different ways of measuring the same phenomenon and then intercomparing.
Okay, here's our 1 to 7. Wow, let's do 1 to 1. We're doing 1 to 1.
This is my 3rd year here, and I think this is Donna's last year.
This is my
She's almost
last year.
done.
And we're enrolled in the molecular organism program, and this is a biochemistry lab for that program where we're studying the functions of enzymes and the rates that are involved when the differences between different enzymes acting on different substrates and whether or not they're inhibited by
competitive or non-competitive inhibitors.
Which is essentially what Michaelis-Menten kinetics
is. Right. It explains the activities of an enzyme on a particular substrate with a hyperbolic curve. And this is what the lab that we're doing right now, and we were just over there in the other room measuring absorbance on a spectrophotometer of 4 different enzyme assays. And what we're doing right now is just figuring out the slope to determine the rate of enzyme dissociation and eventually find the K, which is a constant of the inhibitor that we used.
Betty Cutter was convinced that one of the ways that we would learn the best was by this process of total immersion in a subject that was way over our heads at the time. And so she put us right into reading articles out of the literature and the technical journals about, like genetics.
New England Journal of Medicine, molecular genetic engineering.
Genetic engineering, a lot of information on tailoring drugs for certain functions and what the processes are in the cell that go on when a drug has a certain effect on a cell. And at the time when we were reading these things, it all just totally sounded like Greek, and we had no idea what was being said. And as we went through the quarter, we kept building on a lot of the basic concepts. And it finally got at the end of the quarter to where we really could understand this very difficult, complicated material. And that was a really good feeling.
Right. And the analogy that Betty uses for learning like that with total immersion is picture yourself on a spiral of information, and it's the same information that is on the spiral, but you understand it at different levels. You know, we started out with the molecular level, learning about enzyme activity on the molecular level and how it affects cells. And then from there, we've gone to different systems, like now we're working with the digestive system and muscle.
And we keep coming back to the same ideas, but every time we see them, it's on a more complex level.
Right, and in different context. So that really helps.
So sometimes you feel like you really don't understand anything about what you're doing, and then all of a sudden it's crystal clear that you've seen this before, and now you're just looking at it, you know, in a little bit more complicated way, but it's still the same basic stuff.
Yeah, and labs are the real test of if you know what's going on, because the way that we've prepared for this lab that we're doing now on enzyme kinetics is we started out by reading a couple of chapters in a biochemistry book, and then we had, I don't know, 3 or 4 lectures on that so far, and every day the different constants and the different values make a little bit more sense and start to piece it together just a little bit, and then you go and do it yourself.
What we do is very public. It's out in the air, it's out in the open, so that everybody sees it all the time. You can't sit in my seminar for 6 weeks and not have me know whether you've read the damn book or not.
You have everybody here from high school level that just came out of your regular inner city high school to people who have spent all their life in private schools. And to see that knowledge base come together and mesh, and for me to get something out of it is great.
It's completely up to you. It makes no difference. And then you fulfill, it's a contract that is an agreement between yourself and your faculty. And by the end of the 3 months, you fulfill, you do what you say you're going to do. And it can be anything from, I'm going to go to Africa and take pictures of birds, to I'm going to learn this physics and I'm going to get through chapters 1 through 10. It doesn't matter. So that's what an individual contract is.
Well, for one thing, I changed my mind from competing for the grade to getting an understanding of what was being read. I had to change my mind from memorizing a whole list of facts and figures to understanding those facts and being able to discuss them with somebody else that may have a different point of view about the same fact.
To measure something in a very concrete way is difficult. And we're talking about commodities which are essentially ephemeral. I can say to you, I know that I'm learning something. That doesn't tell you very much. The way I used to be gauged when I was in a conventional university, obviously, was I took an examination and I got a score. And if the score was sufficiently high, then I passed or I got whatever, a letter grade. Here, there isn't that direct correlation. The manner in which I know that I've learned is the same manner that I know that I've grown as a person.
Evergreen State College is it's not a college that's over here. It's all of us.
We have 3 mechanisms by which we are able to kind of track or touch bases with them during the learning process. And the diagnostic interview is when the students come in, and essentially Maxine used to do them and now I do them, where where we do kind of a quick assessment of where the students are at, what their past educational experience is, what their future goals, and that's the topic of the conversations. But it also allows us to see where they see themselves, whether they think whether they have positive images or negative images of themselves. And then halfway through the quarter here, we do an autobiography, and basically the autobiography gives us some indication of whether or not they are responding to the curriculum thrust, which has been over the last 5 or 6 years, getting people to think, to see, to be in different ways, trying to understand that when people come in, they're at this point, and what we try to do is expand them.
To be self-critical has to be in both the positive and the negative mode, and we're usually only given support for saying what we did wrong instead of support and acknowledgement for what we did right. And I think that's where the evaluation has come in, that to look at everything, you know, when people come over and go, oh God, this is happening in my life, you know, and I go, yeah, well, you know, that's good, you know, because now you're going to make a change. You're going to make a major change in your life.
Being here, I've learned to use my own voice as an authority, and and that came about mostly through discovering that the way I apply myself to the books that I read and to the artwork that I do, and you know, the work of other students and faculty is real legitimate, and that's really the only way I can experience it is through my own eyes. And I realized through that, you know, having that kind of authority over how I see things, which seems natural, but I didn't really know for a while that that was so. That what I needed to do was sort of take my responses to other people's work and to programs into my own hands. And it's a matter of discipline in a sense, you know, which was to pay attention to everything around me and start responding to it, you know, and start managing my time so that if I had an idea for what I really wanted to do, I could do it. And I knew that using my own voice that it could happen.
Having to put into language the achievements of a student. Having that student be required to put into language his or her own achievements. Having to specify our judgments, and having students required to specify their judgments about work completed, I think helps people to know several things. It helps them to know what's been learned, what's been sought after, attempted, what's been achieved. It helps them learn something about how to judge. More often than not, I find students being more critical of their work than they sometimes should be, and less confident. So a student will do a very nice painting or write a very good piece of material and come in and say, oh God, this is really awful. I hope you don't hate it and, you know, kill me and stuff. And I say, wow, that's pretty hot. You know, what I'm trying to say is that students learn how to judge in balanced ways what they do. And that comes partly out of what we do here. And then, of course, they learn how to compose and articulate those learnings and those judgments and that kind of stuff. And the fact that students and we sit down together and face each other with our stuff on paper, that is our judgments and our assessments and, you know, our hopes and aspirations on paper, and look across this, 2 feet, nose to nose with a closed door, and say what's on our minds. That fact alone, I think, probably contributes as much to the distinctiveness of how we teach and learn as any other single thing. It is enormously revealing and instructive, and I think just incredibly valuable. Every evaluation I've ever written is there in my portfolio, and every one I've ever received from a student is there in my portfolio. And one of the things that I like to do is to introduce a quarter's work or a year's work or a new program or a new group by saying, by showing, by presenting, if you will, my portfolio. Here's my stuff. Here's what I've said about people who worked with me. Here's what they've said about me and how I work with them. So that the whole business of judging and measuring and tracking our work is out front. It goes back to that business of the publicity of our working and how much in the open that is.
What do you think the evaluation is? What I think it is? Well, I just sort of talked about what I thought I had learned during the quarter and what I thought that I needed to do better on, what I needed to improve on, what I thought I had procrastinated about during the quarter, and how I hoped not to do that anymore, basically.
And who do you think your evaluation is for?
I think it's, well, I know it's supposed to be for yourself, but I sort of felt like I was sort of doing it to kind of like what they wanted me to do, like to impress my seminar leader or whatever, you know. But I think it was good for myself though, because I was pretty honest in it. No, I was. I roasted on myself all over the place.
You know, what program are you in?
Reflections of Nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I like it a lot.
Did you have to do a faculty evaluation?
We didn't have to turn one in, but we had to just make some notes for our personal whatever. And I'm going to talk to my seminar leader when I go in for my evaluation tomorrow.
In the years I've taught, I've given I don't know how many hundreds, perhaps thousands of grades to students. And I know in the 17 years I've been teaching here, I've written thousands of evaluations of students. But I have never experienced a single case in which the student who receives what I write as an evaluation statement doesn't know more about what I think he or she knows than the students for whom I made grades. There's simply no way to compare those things. Several things always happen, almost always, uniformly happen. One is that students are seldom surprised by the content of what I say in evaluation. Regularly, students say to me when we have evaluation conferences, I knew you were going to say such and such about that. I knew you were going to jam me up about that paper. Yeah, I knew you didn't like that one because you said so in your note. Yeah, students know what to expect. They don't have that experience of walking into the final exam saying, oh God, you know, I don't know what grade I'm going to get, and if I do well here, maybe I'll be okay. We don't have that. That just doesn't happen. It's not in our sphere of experience together. Students know what to expect.
Although I'd rather get a D than a bad evaluation. But if you did D-level work, the evaluation would tell you how to get better, one would hope. Somewhere in that process, you would get an idea of what to do to maybe get a C next time. If you just got a D, that doesn't tell you anything except you're bad.
I think that my transcript will be very good for me, but that's only because I've thought about it a lot and because I really work on being a good student. And I'm not always, but you know, I try.
How about yours?
What would people see?
Yeah.
I'd like to think people could see kind of how I grew with conceptually, you know, things, my ideas. I think that that's what I like a lot better than, you know, Gail got a B in English in 1988. And I like the evaluations better. Hopefully they could see my writing get better, and they can see how I think about myself and my progress.
It really forces you to think about what you have spent the last 10 weeks or 20 weeks or 30 weeks doing and what you've really done with it. And I also, it's also useful because it's a part, it's a style of thinking that's not often promoted. While on one hand America talks about that we're all individuals and things like that, people don't always sit down and think about what they've really accomplished. And they don't tend to think of themselves in that context. So I think it's really a useful tool.
Those, I think, are the primary things that make the teaching and learning here qualitatively different from what it is in other places. And I must say, I think qualitatively better, because the world is not divided up into little boxes called history and biology and economics and whatever. Experience is by nature interdisciplinary. And those discipline buckets that we like to fit things into are really more a product of the sort of 19th century German university than anything having to do with the nature of knowledge or the nature of learning. So that to come at experience, to come at questions and issues and problems, sort of as they are, I think cuts out some unnecessary steps between the seeker after knowledge and the knowledge. Now, I've talked a fair amount about how we study and learn. The very content of what we study and learn also contributes. That is to say, the fact that we look at the nature of knowledge and the nature of the world as they are, we hope, and almost always in historical context. That means then, I think, that people and experience and ideas and information are coming into direct contact with each other as they exist. And it's that kind of learning that I think characterizes what we do. And I think that's probably what characterizes best what distinguishes us from learning students do elsewhere. Is that enough?
They are very concerned about integrity, personal integrity, integrity towards the world. I think that the interdisciplinary stuff that we do here does work in this sense, in that I think connected with that integrity, and that question of integrity, is a consciousness about a broader view of the world to bring into work, to bring into life.